So I think we'll begin. We were waiting a couple of minutes to make sure everybody found their way upstairs. Thank you to all of you who found your way upstairs. So I'm Megan Sullivan. I am a faculty member at the College of General Studies, and I'm going to introduce our speaker. But first, I'd like to thank a few people. So we're thrilled to have you here today to discuss this important book. Before I introduce our speaker, I first want to thank those who collaborated to make this event possible. Dean Natalie McKnight very graciously and generously offered to bring Dr. Slater to campus, knowing full well what an important chapter in U.S. history her book unfurls, and recognizing that delving into the complexities of history is a hallmark of the CGS curriculum. A mere few minutes after I sent out a call for co-sponsor, Professor Nancy Harowitz, director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, coordinator in the program in Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, and head of the Italian section in the Department of Romance Studies, responded enthusiastically and unreservedly. Equally enthusiastic was Assistant Director of Party School Center for Asian Studies, Maria Elena Rivera Beckstrom, whose own work on Philippine constitution making is so important for our understanding of colonization. These people graciously encouraged others to join in to help. At CGS, that included Associate Dean Davida Pines and Gregory White. At the Elie Wiesel Center, that included Jenna Rydell and Teresa Cooney. At Party, a not-so-silent advocate with Bill Grimes, Professor of International Relations and founding director of the Center for Asia Studies, for the Study of Asia, sorry. You can read about Dr. Slater's biography, her early scholarly work, her first book on leaving Boston and making a life in Japan, and her forthcoming manuscript on Jewish refugees in Kobe, Japan. So I will not discuss these projects. What I will say is that together Manzanar represents the difficulty and beauty, once you pull it off, as Tracy certainly does, of forging a new voice in the field of narrative history, of using the critical thinking skills honed in academia to attend to documents related to incarceration, perhaps most importantly, to dare to examine the complications of history, our various countries and our own. Today, Slater will discuss the policies that inform a terrible time in U.S. history, a time when we use our rhetoric and racial biases to incarcerate U.S. citizens without due process. Yet throughout the book, Dr. Slater also focuses on the choices, forced and otherwise, that we make as individuals. It's not a spoiler to say that Together Manzanar begins and ends with Elaine Buckman Uneda, a woman who must constantly interrogate the complexities of her own choices and those forced upon her, something we all must do. Dr. Slater will read from her book for about 8 to 10 minutes, discuss the official policies and more for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for your questions and answers. Dr. Slater will gladly sign books outside of the classroom in the hallway, just outside here, over to the right, so you go out the door and go right. There's a table there. Again, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your interest, and thank you.
Is this working? Oh, now
Yes.
it's down at this, okay. A little louder, okay. Okay. First I want to thank Megan Sullivan, Professor Megan Sullivan, for the beautiful introduction, and a huge thanks to the College of General Studies, the Elie Wiesel Center, and the Party Center, for the Party School, Global Studies Asia Center for having me here. It's a real treat. I taught at BU for a little while and in the BU College Mind Arts program, and it feels very special to be back here. So I want to thank all of you. As Professor Sullivan said, I'm going to read from the book briefly. Is that too loud, or is it okay? Okay. I'm going to read from the book briefly, and then I'm going to show some pictures and talk you through some documents related to this history in the book, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. So, Chapter 1, Forced, March 30th, 1942. Just past dawn, Elaine Buckman Yoneda stood on a Los Angeles sidewalk, unsure where to turn. She looked up at the building before her, solid concrete and stretching half a block, the South Spring Street Civil Control Station, where she'd been ordered to bring her 3-year-old son, Tommy, in deportation to a concentration camp. In the early morning light, a cool wind strafed her cheek and rustled her brown curls. She hesitated for a moment, then straightened in resolve. Reaching just under 5 feet, Elaine was known to still stand tall in the face of adversity, rising as if she could launch past such minor constraints as biology, as if she'd tower over anything in her way. She paid no heed to nature's limits. Elaine would stare down anyone who tried to take her son. Keeping Tommy by her side, she surveyed the crowd of people already waiting, one long line snaking down South Spring Street. Overhead, trolley cables hung in the air, taut black wires against a pale sky. The streetcars would be getting even more use soon, as rubber rations made new tires scarce. Essentials would continue to dwindle now that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor and the country was at war. Many in line that morning wore their Sunday best, despite the new deprivations of wartime. They may have been Japanese, but almost all were American too. Some were likely U.S. veterans, Elaine knew, having served their country faithfully. But not even that would matter now. Before answering the order to appear that morning, men had donned ties and bowler hats, women pressed dresses and starched collars. Girls had forced their straight hair into neat waves. Most stood quietly as they peered through the early light, some with heads craned forward, as if they might catch a glimpse of their fate. Elaine was the only white person among them. Looking down, she watched the breeze disturb Tommy's dark ringlets, their hue from her husband, their texture from her. The child breathed in and out, cold air filling his torso, each breath like a gift from the grip of his asthmatic chest. Elaine had spent much of his short life in and out of hospitals with him. Too much dust, too strenuous an exertion could leave him gasping, liable to drown in the liquid of his lungs. But Elaine refused to give in to fear. She would do whatever necessary to protect him. It was him the army wanted, she'd been told over the phone by a priest the night before. Not you, the priest had explained. She'd given birth to a half-Japanese child. The clergyman was from the Maryknoll Mission, a Roman Catholic order that had long worked with the Japanese American community, and was now assisting with their removal from the West Coast. Foreign or citizen, healthy or sick, loyal or lost, all had to go. But as for Elaine, "Oh, you don't have to go, you don't have to go," he'd said the previous evening as she clutched the handset in her parents' apartment, the darkness shrouding their home in the Jewish enclave of Boyle Heights. "Nor will you be allowed to," he'd suggested. Elaine had stared, stupefied, into the air. She was trying with little success to absorb this frocked man's nonsense. That day, March 29th, 1942, Civil Exclusion Order Number 3 had been issued. 2,000 people of Japanese descent living around Elaine were to appear for processing by 8 o'clock the next morning at 707 South Spring Street Civil Control Station in preparation for transport 220 miles inland to a dusty plain called Manzanar at the foot of the Sierra Nevada. In no more than 3 days, by April 2nd at noon sharp, not a soul among them should be left. Elaine had heard the announcement herself over the radio that evening. It had been addressed to all persons of Japanese ancestry, both aliens and non-aliens. It conveyed an order directly from the Western Defense Command and 4th Army of the United States, with a time and place for those in the vicinity of Los Angeles to report the next day for, quote, registration. According to the U.S. Army, her son Tommy, like anyone along the West Coast with even the slightest amount of Japanese blood, was to be rounded up, evacuated, they called it, and sent to a camp. Hearing the announcement, Elaine had been frantic. Surely they wouldn't try to take a 3-year-old half-Japanese child. She'd called the nearest army station. She'd called the Mary Mill mission. The only answer she could get was that she needed to appear the next morning with Tommy, or she'd be in violation of the Army's order. According to federal law, she'd be subject to a fine of $5,000, imprisonment, or both. Now on the sidewalk, with the rising sun throwing shadows across the pavement, Elaine saw a soldier and a priest run towards her. Not here, not here, she heard one of them shouting. The men surrounded Elaine and Tommy, then hurried them towards the building, the former Security First National Bank. Etched columns still flanked the entrance, fluted pillars 3 stories high, stretching towards the cold expanse of sky. Elaine knew immediately why these men balked at her presence in a line not meant for whites. Their haste failed to surprise. She had spent years leading labor demonstrations, protesting California's racist and repressive policies, being menaced by Red Squad batons. She'd even been jailed, bruised by brass knuckles. She defied the state's anti-miscegenation laws by marrying a Japanese-American man, a fellow activist, so she would not be cowed by this priest or soldier before her now. The men ushered Tommy and Elaine inside, the priest again insisting that it was her son they wanted, not her. As if they were just going to roll out the red carpet for her and then expect her to hand over her son, she thought. If these men thought she was just going to surrender her child, well then, they really knew from nothing. I'm skipping page 2 here. Elaine's parents, like Carl's, had immigrated to the United States around the turn of the century. The Buckmans had fled the bloody pogroms of Eastern Europe, where reports of the mass murder of Jews were beginning to emerge in March 1942. Yet in Los Angeles, the Buckmans assumed they were safe because they were American citizens and they were white. Of course, Carl was a citizen too, born right in California. But Carl had gone to Japan as a child when his father fell ill and his parents decided to return to their native village, Hiroshima. Then, as a young man, Carl fled back to California to escape conscription in the Emperor's army. Like the US military in 1942, when the Japanese military looked at Carl in 1926, they saw not an American, but an ethnic destiny. Carl detested Japan's stealing imperialism, their thirst to colonize Asia themselves, rather than leave it to Western conquerors. He disdained their threats against his widowed mother, who'd stayed in Hiroshima after he deserted. Carl and Elaine had together watched in horror as Japan's theory of expansion, its so-called Pan-Asianism, metastasized throughout the 1930s. From slogans to a militarized Manchurian puppet state, to bayonets piercing the flesh of Nanjing's Chinese citizens. Despite the obvious indignity of America's West Coast so-called evacuation, Carl planned to enlist in the US military and fight the Axis as soon as the Allies would take him. He'd do whatever it took to defeat fascism. Who knew what the Japanese would do to a so-called deserter if they captured US soil? But more than that, Carl needed to protect his family. After all, his beloved Elaine was Jewish. Their son was a Japanese-American Jew. Carl had tried to enlist before he left for Manzanar, but the Army recruitment officer had turned him away. Like all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, even war veterans, he had overnight been designated ineligible to serve, considered an enemy alien by his own country. These were among the many heavy disappointments Carl had carried with him on the long and lonely trip to Manzanar a week earlier, when he departed, along with 1,000 other able-bodied men of Japanese descent, on a cold, gray Los Angeles morning, the chill tempting some to turn up their collars. Carl had been comforted, though, by the thought that at least Elaine, Tommy, and Joyce, who was Elaine's white daughter from her previous marriage, Elaine, Tommy, and Joyce would be safe in LA with the Buckmans. He remembered the promise he'd been given, along with the other husbands who had agreed to be among the first at Manzanar, that their families would be taken last, if in his case ever. After all, he assured himself, who would lock up a 3-year-old? When he finally arrived at camp, well past sunset, he felt little else to lift his mood. He was led by flashlight towards a large, unfinished shed, past wooden skeletons of the barracks he and the others had been told they'd come to Manzanar to build. The shelter for the early arrivals like Carl stood empty, without toilets, water, or even window panes. The men were given straw to stuff into sacks for mattresses. Just before midnight, lying in the inky darkness, a bunkmate he'd known from Los Angeles called out to him. "Hey, Carl, we weren't supposed to end up in a place like this." Carl made no attempt to answer. Then, exhausted, he slept. Rising early the next morning in a freeze so deep the water refused to run, Carl and the others found a single spigot rising from the dirt outside one end of the barrack, ice cold and bone dry. Then he got his first full glimpse of camp, a barren, dusty landscape, stacks of construction material, the hospital complex being built upon a hill, barbed wire lacing the front and sides, and soldiers with bayonets and submachine guns guarding the perimeter. In the distance, stood the vast snow-capped spread of the Sierras, their beauty so stark against the desert plain, it took Carl's breath. He ached for Elaine and Tommy, not knowing how or when he'd see them again, or if. But within 3 days, he'd seen enough of the environment, with its howling sandstorms that stopped the men from working and coated every crevice thick with dust. He knew that even if visits would be permitted, his wife should not bring their son anywhere near Manzanar. The food alone was a threat, sending the men running repeatedly for the portable toilet. He wrote to Elaine, warning her against visiting, even if the opportunity arose. She and Tommy should stay away, at least until Carl and the other early arrivals could improve conditions enough to tamp down the dust, perhaps by planting grass around the barracks, vegetable garden. With Tommy's allergies and asthma, the camp could kill him. So I'm going to take you guys through a few pictures and slides. Excuse me. And then we'll have time. Okay, so here's some pictures of the Buckman related. Elaine with her parents, when she was 2 years old in New York City. Her parents were immigrants from the PLO settlement in Russia. the area of the Russian Empire where the Jews were allowed to live. And this is a picture of Carl. He would be about 15 in this picture. We don't have the exact date. And it's from the Oneida family who I was lucky enough to meet their descendants, the Oneida's descendants. And they say that he's holding a book of Karl Marx. So his name at birth was not Karl, it was Goso, and he was a passionate leftist and labor activist. And so he idealized Karl Marx and took the name Karl when he went back to the US as an adult, or as a young adult. And this is a picture of Elaine and Carl right around the time that they first met. Elaine had been married before to a white Irish Catholic man, and she had a daughter, who you can see in this picture. Here's a picture of Elaine and Carl, and Joyce, who is about 11 in this picture. She was about 11 when her little half brother was born, and that's Tommy, in 1939. And the last picture is Elaine and Carl and Tommy with a man named Tom Mooney, for whom Tommy was named. Tom Mooney was a famous labor activist who had been imprisoned for a long time, and Elaine, he was eventually exonerated. He was accused of planting a bomb that he did not plant. And Elaine was also very involved in the labor movement and also a very passionate leftist. And that's how she met Carl in the labor and communist. She joined the Communist Party, and she worked for a labor defense fund, helping to provide legal support to people who had been imprisoned for protesting or for labor agitation. And Carl Mooney was known at the time by many as the most famous prisoner in the U.S. and Elaine was for a decade had been involved in this case. And he was exonerated right before Tommy was born, and they named their son. So, and these details about the family are going to become important, as you'll see in a minute. But first, I just wanted to show you two pictures of Manzanar. Oh, sorry, it's getting cut off, but anyway. The picture on your right is a picture that was taken by an incarcerated. This was taken by a famous photographer who was sent by the government to photograph. This would have been, we don't have an exact date for the picture on the right, but this June 1942, June 29th would have been when about 3 months after the Oneidas got to Manzanar, so they were here at this time. But before I go on, I just want to say a word about why I use the term concentration camp, because I've had many questions and a few concerns about it, and I think it's actually really respect people who ask about it, and it's a really important question, I believe. So I want to explain why I use the term concentration camp or incarceration camp, and why I don't use the term internment camp, which is actually still generally, I think, how the camps are referred to today as internment camps. And the reason, by not well-meaning people, I don't think anyone means to anything by using internment camp, but it's actually a very problematic term, which I will explain, because the legal definition of internment is the detainment of foreigners. And the camps in the West Coast during the World War II, the American camps, 2/3 of the people who were incarcerated, 2/3 of the 120,000 people incarcerated, so we're talking about 80 to 90,000 people, were US citizens, who had never been, and US citizens born in the US, they had never been a foreigner a day in their life until the US military and government decided that because of their Japanese blood, that they were somehow foreign. So I do not use internment camp because I fear that it prolongs the myth upon which the entire forced removal and incarceration is built, which is that regardless of citizenship, regardless of anything, age, infirmity, anything, the only thing that mattered in deciding whether or not someone should be incarcerated, forcibly removed from their home and incarcerated in one of these camps, was if they had any percentage of Japanese blood. And so, and that ethnicity somehow made them eternally foreign, that they could never be real Americans. And so I don't I really disdain the term internment camp because I feel it prolongs the stay. Now, the reason I use concentration camp is because, for a number of reasons. The first is just because if you look at the dictionary definition, this is from Merriam-Webster. All dictionaries will probably, use slightly different wording, but they will all basically explain concentration camp in this way. And this is exactly what Manzanar and the other camps were. They were, a place where a whole group of people were detained under armed guard with no due process. Concentration camp was also a term that was commonly used at the time, when the forced removal and incarceration was conceived and then began to be carried out. Life magazine wrote an article in, I think it was April 6, 1942, countering media reports that somehow the camps were going to be too kind of pushy for the incarcerees because there was so much anti-Japanese racism throughout the country, and people were worried that the camps weren't going to be harsh enough for these fellow Japanese American citizens. And so Life magazine reported, exactly. Yeah, so it was April 6, 1942, and they reported that Manzanar, for all its hopes and assets, was a concentration camp designed eventually to detain at least 10,000 potential enemies of the U.S. They noted that 4/5 of the people who would be incarcerated there would be U.S. citizens. I think it ended up being closer to 2/3. It was 2/3 approximately across all the camps, but anyway, the vast majority citizens. And they further noted, quote, "The commanding general of the West Coast area promised the Army would not shrink from using force to complete the evacuation if other methods failed." And one other, I think, very evocative quote was given in January on the House floor by California Representative Leland Ford, January 1942, so when the incarceration and forced removal were being planned. And his argument was any patriotic native-born Japanese, which means Japanese American citizen, but I guess he couldn't bring himself to say the term, who wanted to contribute to the war effort should, quote, "submit himself to a concentration camp and should not object to that small sacrifice." So they were known as concentration camps at the time as well. So for all those reasons, I use concentration camp or incarceration. Just on a side note, one of the things I learned while I was researching the book is that the Nazi regime in Europe would sometimes use concentration camp as a euphemism to obscure the truth of their own camps, which were really extermination, slave labor camps. So that was interesting and chilling. So I want us to stay away from all euphemisms for this period of history. So this is a picture of the Unitas in Manzanar. And, sorry, 2 pictures of the Unitas. 2 pictures of the Unitas in Manzanar and 1 picture of a media report. Actually, this media report was about the removal of the San Francisco community. The Unitas were from San Francisco, but they had moved to Los Angeles right before our car went to Manzanar, hoping that Tommy and Elaine and Joyce, Elaine's white daughter, could stay with her parents and be safe and maybe visit them if visits were allowed. None of them, again, ever assuming that they would force Tommy to become incarcerated. And that at that point, Elaine would have to make a choice whether to let them take her son to detention in the desert without her, or to stay out of camp. To let them take her son, but if she went into camp with them, she would have to leave behind Joyce, her white daughter. And so that's the choice she faced. You can see Joyce here also. So she was about 14 in this picture, I think, when they went to Manzanar. And they were visiting Manzanar. So this is the Unitas, the 3 Unitas when they were in Manzanar. And actually these 2 were taken the same weekend. And it was a time when visits were allowed. Visits were not always allowed in the camps, but they were allowed sometime. And you can see here Elaine and Carl, you can see Joyce kind of fading into the desert, which I think is kind of like a meaningful representation of the way in which the fragmentation of her family, left her sort of fading away in the family in many ways. She never again lived with her mother or her brother or her stepfather. And the person on the your far right in this picture is a fellow activist, labor activist, so a comrade from the leftist community, who brought Joyce to visit her mother and stepfather and little brother that weekend. So, oh, sorry, I forgot to turn off the lights. Can you guys see?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. And then, so in any case, so the book, in telling the story of the Onedas and Manzanar, the book uncovers three either hidden or obscure histories that are important, I believe. One is the mixed families in the camp, which I'll talk about all three of these in brief after this. The other is the mixed ideologies in the camp. So the Onedas, as I've said, were very passionate and committed leftists. They committed their entire adult lives basically to fighting for labor causes and also against any kind of support of fascism or evidence of fascism even in the US, which actually there was in the 1920s and 30s. And they were more unique actually among the incarcerees in the camp for their leftist ideology than they were for their mixed heritage family. But they were not the only leftists in the camp. But their story helps shed light not only on the mixed ethnicity of the incarcerees in the camps, but also the mixed ideologies among people who were incarcerated in Manzanar and also in all the camps, but I only focus on Manzanar. There were many different ideological positions among the incarcerees, and with those ideological positions came many different approaches and very passionate beliefs about how to respond to the fact that the United States was incarcerating without due process this enormous population of US citizens and their immigrant parents or grandparents, depending on what generation they were. And then the last picture on the right is from there's a leftist newspaper that was reporting on the removal of the San Francisco community about a week after people started going to Manzanar. This was a removal to a temporary camp, and everybody was moved. Many people were moved over to Manzanar, some were moved over to other camps. This camp, the incarcerees were housed in horse stalls, barely converted stalls that were built for animals and that had held animals. But I don't know how much you can see here, but if you can read any of it, you can see that even among the leftist press, there was a very ambiguous way of describing the forced removal of incarceration. There's some admission that this was, a serious and difficult, to say the least, experience for people who were being evacuated. You actually can't see anything; it's too fuzzy. But the newspaper talks about the fact that there were, at the station where people were being put on the train. That there were soldiers in steel helmets holding revolvers, but also noted. So here, you can see this parting is a mixed sorrow. So there was very little representation in any media, even the leftist media, of this just being a pure travesty and a pure constitutional crime. There's a description of young girls who were waiting to be deported, who were it says they were very pretty and very aware of it, and they were flirting with their friends, Oriental and white, so while they're waiting to get on the train. So anyway, so this whole concept of a narrative spin seeping into really completely fake news paved the way for the forced removal and incarcerations, and continued to accompany reports about the camps as the war went on. And I'll note that the camps did not close actually until after the war ended. Well after it was clear that the US was going to be victorious over the Japanese forces. So whatever lie about military necessity there was, which was what the excuse was for incarcerating this population, was that it was military necessity. And I'll get into that in a minute. There's other ways to kind of really break down that lie. Anyway. Okay, so this is the fake news part that I talked about. If you see here, these are 3 newspaper reports. Apologies for this language because it's chilling and deeply disturbing. But I'm only using it because this is what's here. So once a Jap, always a Jap, commented Rankin, Democrat of Mississippi, in report of the move means the forced removal and incarceration. And his point was, he said, I'm for taking every Japanese and putting him in a concentration camp. And he asserted that the west coast of Hawaii were teeming with 5th colonists, which means basically saboteurs, and spies. And actually, the government knew if you can read about in the book, the Navy Intelligence Service had already found that there was no mass threat by the Japanese American community, and that whatever threat there might be among individuals was something that could be handled the same way that the Italian American community and German American community were treated, which is that individual people may have been investigated, but the German American and Italian American community was never removed and incarcerated. It was only the Japanese American community, although we were at war also with the Germans and the Italians. So, and then you'll see here, a Jap is Jap, and 99.9% are behind Japan and Japan's militaristic program. That just was clearly not true, and they, even J. Edgar Hoover said, like, this forced removal and incarceration is because of, he did not actually use political hysteria. I can't remember the exact terminology, but it was something like that. And then you see here, so this is one of the reports that I mentioned very briefly, or an example of the type of report I mentioned very briefly, that Time magazine on April 6th published a rebuttal to. This was the kind of media report that would appear, this was the Los Angeles Times, about the camps not really being any kind of severe experience at all to inhabit. If you see here, the present and prospective Nipponese occupants of they originally called Manzanar Owens Valley Reception Center. If you want to know the prospective and present inhabitants are lucky. They couldn't be censured for hoping on their own behalf that the war lasts for years, because apparently the camp was like a resort or something, I guess they're trying to say. So that's one of the hidden histories that the book looks at, that I think has some is evocative for many of us reading today when we're having debates in our society about the media and about what people are hearing about. Okay, so then the other hidden history, and this is probably the biggest one, is mixed families in the camps. Very little, could find nothing that was written about mixed race families in the camps, other than a couple of scholarly articles. There's been nothing written for a general audience. I consider this book for a general educated audience. So there's been no narrative, nonfiction or narrative history written about the mixed race families. And I believe that these families deserve to have their stories known. Particularly given the family separations that occurred because of the forced removal and incarceration of their Japanese American relatives. So as I said, anyone with one drop of Japanese blood was deemed to be a threat and should therefore be incarcerated, and were incarcerated on the West Coast. And there were like Elaine who were incarcerated at one point or another during the time that the camps were open. These are the statistics. If you'll notice it more often, it was a wife or mother who would go into the camp without so as to not leave her husband or children, usually children, but sometimes just spouse, to be incarcerated without her. One of the reasons you can sense when you read through the documentation about these families is one of the reasons that husbands less often went was because if it was with children, we still have this assumption that the mother will take care of the children. That's not that unusual, but also there was some chance that there was a non-Japanese relative, like a husband, she would stay at a camp, and the family would not lose everything financially because they would be working. It's much less common for a wife to be working, and probably, well, I don't know, I don't have statistics about it, but it was much less common for a wife to not be a breadwinner. There was some chance for the breadwinner to stay. So yeah. So these are the statistics, and you'll see here that Colonel Benditson, who was the man who sort of authored and then ran the entire fortune move on the beginning of the incarcerations, he was reported to have said, if they have one drop of Japanese blood, they must all go to camp, even if they're orphans. And there were orphans who were taken away. There were a couple of orphans. Manzanar was the only camp that had an orphanage. So anyone who was either an orphan or had no parent that could be incarcerated with them, because they didn't have let's say a white parent who was willing or able to go into camp. They were all in Manzanar, anyone who was being orphaned. There was a whole orphanage that was taken out of Los Angeles together. It was an orphanage for Japanese American kids. There were infants there. There were a couple of children in the Manzanar Children's Village, which is what they called the orphanage, who had never even known that they had any Japanese ancestry at all. And someone checked their file at the military, and they were taken away from their families or their living situation, their foster family, in one case, went to camp. So the other reason I think that the mixed families story is a really important story to tell, not only to honor the different experiences that these families had and the family separations that they suffered, was because if you look at the policies that defined and policed the mixed marriage and families, the mixed ethnicity families in and around the camps, you can perhaps paradoxically see one of the clearest windows into the racial obsession that underlay the entire forced removal and incarceration. And this in particular, let me move this. And these two documents I actually had blown up and made into, because they're so unbelievable. So feel free after the talk to come in, you can see really clearly. Sorry, I'm not sure what I was saying. But they show, so there are still, according to some surveys, there are still people in the United States who believe that military necessity was an underlying motivation for the forced removal and incarceration. And if you look at the policies defining and policing mixed marriage families, you see there's no way to continue to believe that. Besides just the fact that there were, orphans and elderly people who were infirm and infants who were taken. You can really see the racial obsession here. I'm just going to point out two quick parts of these documents, but again, as I said, you're welcome to look at them more closely and an easier way to see them after these two. So this form here, request and waiver of a non-excluded person, was the form that was signed by family members who had no known Japanese ancestry, like Elaine. Now, Elaine was the first white mother, and the first mother of no known Japanese descent to go into any of the camps. Manzanar was the first camp that opened. So Elaine was among the first group of incarcerees who went. And she was on record anyway. Actually, the government records are not completely perfect. So I can only say what's on record, what we can find in the existing government records. But likely, because Elaine was among the first group of incarcerees, it likely is accurate that she was the first family member of no Japanese descent to go into camps. So this, she did not sign this. But as the forced removal and incarceration went on throughout the spring and summer, and more families were taken from the coast as the scheduling for the deportations basically went along the coast. The administrators who were responsible for registering the families, were noticing, well, there are actually some people in mixed families that apparently the government hadn't thought about. And so they didn't know what to do. What do we do? Do we allow people to stay out of camp? And so the government very, very soon after this issue arose said, no one can stay out of camp. If a person who is no Japanese ancestry wants is in the family, then that person will either be separated from their family or they can choose to go into camp with their family. But in order to choose, you had to sign a form that said that you agreed to conform it to in all respects as if you were a person of Japanese ancestry. So if you can change your ethnicity on paper, you therefore change your incarcerability. And then you can see more clearly, but it's repeatedly. I'm agreeing that I'm becoming an incarceree and waiving my right to leave. So clearly becoming an incarceree without duress or persuasion. So they're forcing these people not only to say they're becoming as if Japanese, but also to say that they are choosing the situation when in fact who we choose this. So this is for people going into the camps. This other sheet here, which is here, blown up version, is so as the forced removal and incarceration went on and the camp populations began to grow, despite this sort of ruse that everybody in camp was as if Japanese or Japanese, it became clear to everybody that there were people in the camp who were mixed or who had no Japanese descent. And this was very disconcerting to many in the administration. So there began to be a discussion about who could apply for freedom from the camps, based on this mixed the mixed ethnic status of their family. And I won't go through this whole form right now, but you can see the clear obsession with both race and gender in this form. You could apply, nobody was guaranteed release, but you could apply for release to be freed from the camp, but you could not go home if you were, so you had to basically be able to move east. You had to, and for most people, they couldn't move east. They had already been forced to give up everything they owned within, a couple of days before their deportation to camp. So you could apply for release, but you'd have to be able to pay for yourself to resettle east. You couldn't go back to the West Coast. This was an option that was only open to families, that was open to families where the husband might have been Japanese or Japanese American, the wife not Japanese, and they had children. Now, only families with children were allowed to apply for release under the mixed marriage policy, because the mixed marriage policy its objective was to, quote, protect mixed blood children from a Japanese foreigner. So if you didn't have kids and you were in a mixed family, you couldn't apply for release under this policy. Wouldn't help. So you could apply for release and also the permission to go home to the West Coast if you were a mixed marriage family, but only if the husband was non-Japanese. The wife was Japanese or Japanese American, and you had children. You could also, if you were a Caucasian mother, and this was, so the mixed marriage policy kept changing throughout the war, because it made no sense, and no one knew how to, implement it. But at this point, this iteration, a Caucasian mother with, children could apply for freedom from camp and could apply to return home, but only if she had children who were sired by a Japanese father who was long since departed or dead, long since departed from the family or dead. So anyway, the rest of this policy is here, and this is actually on the first page. If anyone would like to see the full policy, please feel free to get in touch with me. I can send you a link to it. It's publicly available. It's just maybe a little bit hard to find. For any of these documents or anything I'm talking about, I'd love to get in touch with other questions. Okay, so let me just quickly move on. I'm almost at the end here. Okay, and then the mixed ideologies, as I mentioned earlier, there were many different people in camp who had many different political ideologies and many different, particularly, you often related to these ideologies, many different passionate beliefs about how to respond to the incarceration. As I said, the Unitas were confirmed leftists, and they were both members of the Communist Party, although they were kicked out of the Communist Party because all Japanese American members of the US Communist Party. So they were members of the US Communist Party. All Japanese American members of the US Communist Party were kicked out less than a week after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I have the actual date and stuff, I can't remember what it was. And their spouses. So, and this foresaw in many ways, this foreshadowed the leftist opinion throughout the country, which was that what was, the camps may or may not be a crime against the Constitution and against the fellow citizens and their families who were incarcerated. This was not something that could be litigated or even discussed while the war was going on, because what needed to be prioritized, this is from the leftist position, it's not what I'm saying. What needed to be prioritized was the fight against the Axis, against the Germans and also the Japanese imperialists. And this was actually a quote that was said by a visitor, a friend of the Yonedas who visited them in camp during that time that visits were allowed, who walked around camp and took notes. He was an editor and a writer for a leftist paper, a Jewish paper. And he said this to them, and the Yonedas actually agreed quite strongly. I think in some ways in order for them to be able to continue to keep their place in the leftist community while they were in camp, they had lost almost everything. They had lost less than a lot of people because Elaine's family was able to keep some of their belongings. So they didn't have to give up everything material, but they had lost everything besides some material goods, and they had also been, suffered a kind of unique family fragmentation. Elaine having to leave her daughter, to leave with her daughter, their parents. But in order for them to maintain their connection to the leftist community, which they had been passionately engaged with their entire adult lives, this was a line that they had to repeat and enforce and argue, even from within an American concentration. Because of these mixed ideologies and because of the passionate belief that many people held from many different sides, there were Japanese immigrants in the camp, elders, who were not allowed to, none of them were allowed to become US citizens, because you couldn't become a US citizen, you were East Asian. Sorry, I think it might be if you were Asian, but I have to double check that. I know you could not become a Japanese citizen, you could not become a US citizen if you were Japanese. So you were born in Japan. So there were some people in the camp who were not willing to denounce the Japanese government, which was understandable in part, not so much to Carl because he was so vehemently against the Japanese imperial forces, but somewhat to Elaine, in that she said, they were never given a chance to belong to any other country, even though they moved here and had children. So no, you know, it makes sense that they are not gonna completely sever their emotional attachment to the only country that will claim them citizens. So there were a small group of people in the camp who were pro-Japan. There was a small group of leftists in the camp and in the other camps who vehemently believed that you could not do anything to criticize the US government or because it would dampen the allied fight, basically, that you had to basically just accept the incarceration in the moment and whatever crime is being committed, deal with it if and when the US won the war. And I will add, in 1942, it actually looked like the US was going to lose the war, the US the Allies. I mean, the German and the Italian forces, sorry, not the Italian, the Italian forces folded pretty quickly, but I don't remember exactly when, but the German and the Japanese forces were both making huge military gains at this point. So it really did look like, you know, the Axis forces not only could, but would win. It looked like that in 1942. So they felt in order to support the war effort and do everything possible, they needed to not criticize the government, even from inside the camp. And what happened, which is the climax of the narrative of my book, in December 1942 was the United called it the Manzanar riot. Historians today generally call it the Manzanar uprising or revolt. That's the term that I use. It was a violent event, during which number of incarcerees were beaten very severely. About 10 incarcerees were shot, and the incarcerees were beaten by other incarcerees. And then there were 10 or 11 incarcerees who were shot by military police, and 2 young men who were killed by military police. One of whom had a brother fighting. They were American, so I had a brother. I believe the brother was an Italy fighter. And Elaine and Tommy, the family learned that both Carl and Tommy were marked for death leading up to this riot or revolt. And Elaine and Tommy barely escaped. It looked like they might not make it out alive. So anyway, that's the culmination of my book. And the Yoneda's story, the culmination of their time, the Manzanar, of course, the end of the story. And as I alluded to earlier, please feel free to get in touch if you want to see any of these documents, or of course we'll have time for questions now, but so thank you.
Tommy and Elaine marked for death.
Okay, so I'm sorry. Carl and Tommy were marked for death. Did I say Elaine and Tommy? I'm sorry. Carl was first put on a death list by a group of people who felt deeply disturbed by the potential collaborationist stance that Carl and the other leftists in the camp took towards the administration and the US government, and by saying, so Carl repeatedly wrote letters to the leftist press. Elaine did it as well, but Carl wrote more, and he repeatedly stressed, as did Elaine publicly, that the US camps might be rustic and hard to live in, but they could not be compared to the brutality of the Imperial Japanese, like POW camps or there wasn't much knowledge at that point about what was happening inside the Nazi camps, but it was clear that there was mass murder going on, and slave labor, and so his point was they cannot be compared to the camps of our enemies, and so they're really not that bad. And of course, there was a huge portion of incarcerees who felt like, first of all, they were that bad, maybe not that bad, but they were bad enough. And also that to be a true American, they should say, this is not right. Like, this is totally not democratic or constitutional. And actually, I have compassion for both. It's like one of those situations where there really is no purely right answer, decision. That both sides, even though they're vehemently opposed to each other, both sides have really, beliefs that you can really have compassion for. So in any case, as the stress of the incarceration wore on, and again, nobody knew that it was even gonna end. And there was a lot of agitation among the American public in general that not only should the Japanese American citizens be put in camps, but they should have their citizenship revoked and be sent to back to Japan, although they had it was hardly anyone who was Japanese American had ever even been to Japan. It'd be like sending me back to Russia, it's my family's, settled. So this became, as the stress of incarceration wore on, more and more people felt more and more angry at the administration and the US government. And so it started to become more and more violent. And in Manzanar, there was a death list that was written out. Carl was put on the death list because he was one of the most vocal leftists and one of the most vocal voices for the only thing we can focus on is supporting the war effort. And then he was one of the first people to volunteer to go to the war front, and he left Manzanar about 4 or 5 days before the Manzanar uprising. So Elaine and Tommy were there alone, trying to get out. And as the uprising fomented and as it became more and more violent over the period of about 24 hours, there were some people who said, well, there were a group of about 14 people who went and volunteered when Carl left. And people said they are collaborationists too. And because Carl's not here, but his son is here. So we can get his son. So yeah, it was scary for them, obviously. Terrible. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of Israel-Palestine, where there's at least makes some sense that the Israelis, were worried that the Palestinians are gonna take them over. But what were the Americans afraid of that the Japanese were gonna do to them? I'm not getting it. And what did they think that the children were gonna do to them?
Yeah, they did, there's no way to explain it. There's no way to explain that.
I keep
other
trying
than
to
racism.
understand, but I'm not.
There is no way to explain it other than
It's just pure prejudice, there's no logic to it.
no logic. And if you look at what happened with the mixed marriage families, you can really see there is no logic to thinking if someone has, what percentage of blood or something makes someone dangerous. It had nothing to do with anything other than racism.
And they didn't think that the Germans were dangerous, only the Japanese. They didn't incarcerate the Germans.
So if you look at some media reports, the way that the fight with Germany was represented was like a fight among brothers. The US and the Allies and the Germans, but the fight against the Japanese, particularly in the West Coast, the press really spun it as a fight of civilization against savagery, and that savagery had to do with the blood of people and not with whatever kind of situation they were in. So
you understand why they didn't incarcerate Germans? I'm still trying to.
because the German Americans and Italian Americans were considered white.
Oh, white,
Well,
the
they
color.
incarcerate some.
They incarcerated, but I'm talking about citizens. No, they were different camps.
Oh.
So, but didn't they incarcerate citizens based on if there was evidence that an individual might be dangerous?
Well, they made up a lot of stuff about the Italian
Okay.
Americans, but they couldn't really move them in mass numbers from the East Coast. So that's probably the reason they didn't move a lot of German Americans either. But they did send some to Montana to a camp. So they weren't all untouchable, and the Italians on the California coast got moved inland. They wouldn't let them live on the coast anymore, but they didn't put them in camps on the West Coast.
Oh, I didn't know, Italian Americans even? Okay, so yeah, so there's a lot of important adjacent issues here that my book doesn't cover, but I'm glad that you shed some
So we
light.
don't understand why this happened, basically. Why they did this, we don't.
Other than racism, no,
Okay,
yeah,
and children also, we don't.
infants, yeah,
We
no,
don't understand.
no.
So related, as the Japanese were round up, have any sense on the economic figure of how much property was stolen from them?
Yeah, I don't actually have that figure. I don't even have it in the book, but you can find that figure. And if you're interested, you're welcome to get in touch with me. There's been a lot of scholarship written about that.
Right, because
so-
with, in addition to racism, could there also be?
So there are historians who say that actually this was a kind of an attempt at a land grab, right? That there were a lot of, so the Oneidas actually did not have a lot materially, but there were a lot of farmers and fishery people who had actually built very thriving businesses who then had to basically either give it away or sell it at a pittance, because they were given, like 3 days to, yeah. So there's been a lot of interesting stuff written about that. It's not my area of expertise. I didn't really tell you any of this, but
Thank you.
yeah. Good point.
Here, let me give you a.
Question, but statistically speaking, there was not a lot of left-leaning Japanese Americans. And out of, again, if you look at the basic ChatGPT search, it will say mixed marriage, mixed families, about 150. Left-leaning, even less. Can you talk about how you end up picking that specific family to as main character?
Yeah, so actually ChatGTP, is that what it is? ChatGTP is wrong about mixed families. There were more than 150 mixed families. There were about there were about 2,100 people in mixed families in the camp. So I don't think 150 is right, but actually it could be. But anyway, yes. So the reason I came across this family is because I'm Jewish American, Ashkenazi Jewish American, and my husband is Japanese, not Japanese. And when we were having our first and only child, I remember thinking like, our child is going to be the first Japanese American in our family, and also the first Jewish Japanese American in our family. I mean, I became really interested in learning about the intersection of these two histories, and God knows why. But one day I just did a Google search on Jewish wives and Japanese American concentration. I have no idea why I did that. And I came across this family, and I thought, wow, they're actually quite easy to find information about because they were labor activists. There was a lot written about them, not about their time in Manzanar. There was a lot written about them. They were frequently in the media. Elaine was very well known. Carl was well known among the Japanese American community as like the foremost communist. And Elaine was known as the Red Angel, by the leftist press, and the Tiger Woman or something. I have the quote by the Hearst and the conservative press. So there was a lot about them, but very little about their time in Manzanar. And I first read about them and I couldn't shake it. It had its flaws in me. I just really was fascinated by them, and I really wanted to know what was it like for Elaine in particular to be this Jewish mother in America, passionately engaged in supporting the Allied war effort from inside an American concentration camp with her Japanese American husband and Japanese American child. So it was more just like the personal. And the leftist part that I just learned about, as I was researching, because the violence that they experienced in Manzanar was much more, they did experience an anti-Semitism that I wrote about, but the threat to them was much greater because of their loud leftist politics than because of their mixed race status. I mean, they endured some like name calling and stuff like that, but no one threatened them because of their mixed heritage. That's a good question.
I guess, if you don't mind, I guess speak loudly, but,
What's better is, the
Okay,
mic.
I'm hesitant to ask this question, but I will ask it anyway. I want to know about your decision about the usage of concentration camp, because as we know it, the use of a concentration camp is usually associated with the experiences of European Jews, right? And by using concentration camp in this instance, right, or in this experience of Japanese Americans, and I'm not minimizing their experiences, right? But there's some sort of equivalence in the experiences of the two groups of people, And by doing that, it is almost I can't find the right word, but it's like the illusion of the experience, gravity of the experiences of European Jews. And again, I'm not minimizing the experiences of Japanese Jews or Japanese Americans here.
Yeah, I've gotten some emails, a number of emails from concerned readers who have said, actually, you're, by using the term concentration camp, you're minimizing what happened in the Nazi camps. And I have emailed back and I said, in no way is my intention to minimize what happened in Nazi Europe. I mean, my family was not there, but I had extended family. My family, direct family, thank God, had come to the US before the war. But I don't consider, at base, I don't consider the Nazi camps to be concentration camps. They may have started out in the 30s as concentration camps. And they actually started out as camps targeting communists and political radicals. But by the time they became what we know today, what we remember most today, they were really slave labor and extermination camps. And so for that reason, when I talk about the Nazi camps, I use extermination and slave labor camps. And when I talk about the US camps, I use concentration camp, and then I explain what I said earlier about internment, and also about just the definition of a concentration camp. And people have, for the most part, been very gracious with that explanation. But I know it's hard, and I know in no way, this is a difficult time in so many ways for so many people. I won't say for everybody, but for many, many people. And like in no way do I want the title of the book or the concept of the book to feel distressing or to feel that I'm minimizing anyone's experience. But I do feel, particularly because I think this myth still exists, that they were internment camps and they were foreigners, they should be called what they were. So it's a really important question.
I have a let's hear the rest of the story kind of question. What happened to them after?
What happened to the camp? Yeah, so, okay, I'll tell you a little bit about what happened, but I am gonna leave a little bit, vague, so that if you are interested in reading the book, you don't have full knowledge. So I will say, the last chapter of the book explains what happened for Carl, Elaine, Tommy, and Joyce, and their relatives, some of their relatives, after the war, and after Elaine and Tommy and Carl all got out of the camp in their different ways. I will also say that Elaine and Carl made good on their claim that the time to challenge the US government for whatever crime was being committed by incarcerating the Japanese American West Coast community, that should be addressed after the war. And they did address that. They became very involved in the redress movement. They continued to be very involved in leftist politics, and they continued to, particularly Carl, continued to talk about Manzanar as a metaphor, not in a kind of belittling way, but as a representation of much of the oppression that continued to go on in society. He at some of the Manzanar pilgrimages, he talked about Manzanar as a reflection of, the US prison system, as a reflection of, Manzanar was actually built on land that was once native land. So he talked about that. So they did stay true to their politics, and particularly deeply, they stayed true to each other. So at base, I feel like it's kind of really a love story of a couple that nothing could break them, or their bond, not the fragmentation of their family, not even being incarcerated in concentration. So So, and if you want more, email me and I'll tell you offline.
I didn't have the book, I just haven't had time to finish it. I've actually been talking about Tommy and future generations.
So both I will say one other thing, both Tommy and Joyce were deeply scarred by the experience. I mean, Elaine and Carl, of course, were too, but Tommy and Joyce, in many ways were kind of, particularly Tommy, because we have more documentation about Tommy. Kind of heroically built a life and a family, but he struggled with very dark demons. Joyce, also really struggled, was never even really able to live there. So you could really see the cost for this family, that, went well beyond, 1945, 1946.
We should probably take this as the last question, just because we have to be out of the sector.
Hi, my name is Hiromi Gustas, and actually, I'm originally from Tokyo, Japan. And I came to this country and I met my Jewish American husband, and I got converted. I got converted before I got married.
You got what?
Converted to Judaism.
Oh, you heard it.
Yeah, yeah. And why I converted is really my in-laws were Holocaust survivors, and they both managed to get out from Germany and Austria just before, but but their parents died in concentration camps. And I think just one question is, like Maria said, I think my Jewish relatives would be really upset about your usage of concentration camp because of their memory and and also my father-in-law, he was very leftist person, but he was also a staunch Zionist. Yeah, and then he managed to came to the States, and then and when we had a argument about this issue, he was really staunchy and supported American policy about that, and I said, Dad, your own parents perished in concentration camp, and yes, and but he said, oh, that's a very different or something. So yeah, it's a really interesting, how that the Jewish, and Jewish left, really, about the, how their attitude, how percentage attitude was, these, American, Japanese American experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so we should probably, just because I know we have to be out by 6:30 and they told me to make sure I eat that. So